Ian, just in between series of Page 94, could we do a special one-off episode about Revolving Doors?
You can do what you like. I'm off. I've used the contacts I've made here to get myself a job on Mail Online.
Page 94, the Private Eye Podcast.
Hello and welcome to a one-off special edition of Page 94. My name is Andrew Hunter-Murray and this is a bonus inter-series podcast all about the revolving door between government and the world of big business. If you don't read the magazine, first of all, please go and buy the magazine. And secondly, in our last issue, we had a special 6-page report all about this distinctly murky system. Private Eye's crack investigative squad have been looking into it for some years now, and it has reached almost epidemic proportions lately. First up, here is one of the authors of the report, Richard Brooks, explaining exactly what the revolving door is.
The revolving door is a slightly tongue-in-cheek reference to the way that senior officials and politicians can move seamlessly from their public position into a very lucrative private payday.
And it's an internationally recognised phenomenon as well. Here is the fellow Private Eye reporter and the co-author of the special report, Solomon Hughes.
In Japan, it's known as Amakaduri, which means descent of the gods from heaven, because the government gods descend into the world of corporate enterprise. Very, very dramatic saying, whereas in France they call it pantouflage, which means putting on a lovely warm pair of slippers.
The history of the revolving door may sound like it stretches back to ancient Japanese feudal tradition, but you will be delighted to hear that it is still being practiced and perfected even today. Here's Richard Brooks.
George Osborne's top advisor, a chap called Rupert Harrison, nice chap, old Etonian, often does a lot on the television and radio now. When he was with George Osborne in the Treasury, he came up with the idea of what some people have called a pensions free-for-all, where people can just take all their pension savings and do what they want with it, spend it on a Lamborghini, anything like that. But of course they don't do that. They buy other financial products sold by companies like BlackRock Asset Management, the biggest asset manager in the world, which is, funnily enough, where he now works. Having left George Osborne's office, he has become a managing director at BlackRock.
Okay, so there's clearly an incentive for someone who's in government or is making policy to try and come up with policies that are friendly towards the business areas that they know about. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's it. They would say that's just a terrible calumny and that they have far too much integrity for that kind of thing. And I think they probably aren't sitting in their offices in Whitehall thinking, aha, here's a clever wheeze, I'll be able to cash in on this in a few months' time. It's not quite as blatant as that. It's a bit more insidious and ubiquitous. And there might be other long words to describe it as well. But the point of this special report was to show just how widespread this phenomenon is and just how standard it is for officials to leave a public job and move into a private job in a very similar area. So you create this environment in which there's an expectation that you will get a job in the private sector. That's going to affect your behaviour while you're in office, because you're likely to see things the way that your prospective employers will. You want to have some sort of integrity. You want to be consistent. You will also be regularly meeting your former colleagues who've not so long ago spun through the revolving door and are now representing firms that you're involved with as a regulator or a policymaker. The two sides become very entwined and everybody starts to think alike. That's the problem. You remove all the tension between the public sector and the private sector, which you would hope produces the right result, and you end up with everybody thinking like the people who want to make money.
And is this partly because the private sector is much more involved in government? I'm thinking of large contracts being dished out to prisons or to the health service or anything like that, because that has risen a great deal over the last, 20, 30 years.
That's right. The revolving door really became a bit of a controversy in the early days of privatisation. Peter Walker, for example, was the energy secretary who sold off the gas industry, and he then went to work for British Gas in the 1980s. So there were the occasional scandalous examples like that, but the phenomenon grew in number drastically under New Labour when their version of privatisation was outsourcing and the private finance initiative.
See page 94, episode 18.
So, case in point of a senior minister who's recently left government, perhaps looking around for something to do with his whole life ahead of him, of course, David Cameron. So what's the next Prime Minister to do?
You know, when people reach top jobs at a very young age, they're going to they know they're going to have to do something afterwards, and especially with no way back into politics. Once you crash and burn, you're gone. That's it. Cameron won't be a Westminster politician again. So you've got to think seriously about what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And of course, you're going to leave your options open. In our special report, we ran through what some of the new Labour lot have done: Brown, Blair, Mandelson.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Tony Blair is widely known as having taken a huge number of business jobs all over the world, but except it's not really clear what exactly he's taken, because it's all done through a company. Is that right?
Yeah, Tony Blair runs his affairs through a very opaque structure. He has a limited liability partnership, a limited partnership, and a limited company, a kind of chain of ownership that conceals what he's doing, how much he's earning. You have no idea what his income is or where it comes from. And of course, he didn't take a position in the Lords, so he doesn't have to declare anything publicly. Peter Mandelson, on the other hand, did take a position in the Lords, but he's found a loophole in the regulations governing what you have to declare by setting up a consultancy and saying, I earn money from this consultancy, and we don't know who the consultancy's clients are. We get the odd glimpse, but we don't know all of them.
But surely if the consultancy has clients who want Mr. Mandelson to lobby for them using his doubtless impeccable roster of clients that he's built up in government and contacts that he's built up in government, there's no way around this in the rules? There's no way to say, look, are you working for companies who are lobbying the government, and might that have any bearing on...
No, the rules say that if you are personally involved, then you should declare who the client is. But he says he's not personally involved, and he appears to have had some sort of clearance from the Lord's authorities to say that's okay. It looks very odd, because we know that people take on his firm because of him. They don't
they don't take on the firm and say, I hope we get Mandelson, when it's Mandelson's firm.
That's right. The firm is called Global Counsel.
Okay.
It's essentially Lord Mandelson and a chap called Benjamin Wegg-Prosser. Big corporate clients don't phone up and hope they get Benji.
Of course.
They want the organ grinder.
One thing I found remarkable in the report was I mentioned that Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, he actually intervened and overruled the Mandarin who was looking at these appointments, and had suggested a long period of quarantine for a military figure, Air Chief Marshal Sir John Day, who wanted to work for BAE Systems.
Yes, Blair very early on overruled ACOBA, the committee that was saying, as they sort of would, they were saying, oh no, you can't just let this top military official join a top arms supplier, because how can we be sure that future generals won't just think, oh well, I've got a cosy berth there with the arms supplier, so I won't be too tough on them, or something like that. And that was absolutely standard, and Blair stood in and overruled them, said no, and this was him chipping away, because he wanted to chip away at the barrier between the public and the private sectors.
And the military was the area where the revolving door really got spinning first.
In fact, back in 2004, the advisory committee that looks at business appointments said that it can be argued that the numbers seeking such employment are so significant as to amount to a traffic from the Ministry of Defence to the defence contractors. So we have this consistent flow of top brass from the MOD and the services into the big arms companies.
Arms trafficking.
Arms trafficking.
Thank you very much.
Right. Well done. But you can imagine what it means in practice. If you're a field marshal or a general and you're in your 50s, you're thinking about something else to do, the Ministry of Defence listen to what you say about what the armed forces need. So are you going to say, look, let's not cut tens of thousands of troops. Let's instead save some money on these big, huge, multi-billion pound, often wasteful equipment contracts. Which side are you going to come down on? Well, if you know there's a good chance that you're going to get a job if you say the right thing in the arms company, that's seriously going to influence how you behave.
It's the one area of tremendous featherbedding, waste, late contracts, over-expensive contracts, machinery that doesn't work. So it's not this transmission of expertise is not actually associated with efficient government work. It's rather the opposite.
I'm just looking now at the aircraft carriers example that you cite, which have that in 2008 they would have cost about £2.9 billion. Now they're costing £6.2 billion, and those are huge contracts, obviously, which have gone to the Aircraft Carriers Alliance, which is a mix between a British and a French company, isn't it? Thales.
Which is some kind of god. Thales. He's one of these gods descended from heaven. He's a god of very expensive contracts.
Which is a French company, and Babcock of BAE Systems.
Yes, and of course one of the features was it doesn't matter if it's a French company or if it's the British company, they're all going to grab some senior British official or some senior British ex-minister. It appears to be associated that's part of the deal. Now, obviously, people say that relationship isn't that close, but standing back from it, it looks like there is a close association with the revolving door and big contracts, and unfortunately also a close association with a revolving door and big contracts that go wrong, don't work, are late, cost too much.
So, who is meant to be regulating all of this? You may have heard the name ACOBA earlier on. Well, here it is again.
There's a body called ACOBA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments,
okay,
which is a Cabinet Office committee.
So that's civil service.
That's right, and it advises the Prime Minister. Officially, the Prime Minister has to opine on these very senior appointments, and she is advised by ACOBA, which is chaired by a peer called Baroness Browning, Angela Browning, who was a Tory minister in the 1980s, a junior minister. And we've looked at the committee in some detail, and unfortunately it might as well not be there for the job it does.
They said to us, we don't have a policing remit. They haven't been given a policing remit because the ministers who are in charge haven't given them the remit to police ministers, which that's not surprising in one way. Now, of course, some ACOBA chairpeople and members have been better than others. There's absolutely no doubt some have pushed harder than others, some have been softer than others. But the system is set up to make a flap and do nothing.
Right.
Which is the classic British way. There you go. We've looked at this, and we've worried, and we've decided to do very little.
Let's say I've just been fired from my job as Secretary of State for Transport, and I've got a large transport company, whether it's road building, bus firm, whatever it might be, saying, come and work for us for £250,000 a year, very light work, you won't even have to empty your own bin at the end of the day. What do I do next?
Well, next you have to put in an application to the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. And they will run it past your former department. On that application, you're supposed to say what involvement you've had with your putative employer.
Let's say I dished them out a contract for a few £1 million last year.
Then you should say that.
Right.
And you would hope that the committee would then say, well, that's beyond the pale, you can't go and work for that company.
Okay, and does that happen very much?
It appears not to. We looked at the figures going back to 2010, and we found that of around 530 jobs, these are ministers or very senior civil servants, the Sir Humphrey type figures, that none had been rejected. They'd approved every single one.
Wow.
Now, they do impose conditions.
Okay.
There's a default condition, which is a 3-month waiting period. That's okay. You can get your garden looking nice in that sort of time before you step back into the boardroom. And then for other jobs that look a bit more controversial, like the kind of example you've just given, they might suggest a longer waiting period.
Okay. And
in our current issue, we've just written about the latest big job that ACOBA has approved. That was for General Sir Peter Wall, who was head of the General Staff, so he ran the Army for a long time. The Army gets lots of kit from the big manufacturers, including a US company called General Dynamics. It's got a multi-billion-pound contract with them. And ACOBA said, well, this doesn't look great. We've even thought about not approving this. But, oh well, he's not a bad chap, and I think we can trust him. So we will approve it.
Okay.
So it has been approved with an 18-month waiting period.
18 months?
From when he left office. But he left office on 1st of January 2015, which means, conveniently enough, he can step straight into the boardroom.
Right.
You get an example like Dave Hartnett, who was the former top tax inspector in HMRC. He had extensive dealings with HSBC when they had just been exposed for their huge Swiss offshore tax evasion, and HMRC had got this disc full of details. He met the bank half a dozen times. As you know, the bank emerged from that completely clean. They didn't get prosecuted, even though they were behind massive tax evasion. Yet he told Akoba his dealings with the bank had been no more significant than with other banks, which was clearly misleading. He also took a job with Deloitte, an accountancy firm with whom he'd struck many deals, dozens of deals with big companies on tax settlements, and with whose chairman he'd met 48 times in 5 years, and with whom he was on very good terms. He took a job with that firm, and Akoba said, well, he had dealings with all accountancy firms, so that's okay. So there's an obfuscation going on in the process. Applicants downplay their previous involvement with a company they want to work for, and Akoba publishes summaries that don't give you the full truth either.
The Advisory Committee on Business Appointments says to former ministers and former officials, all right, you can have this job, but you can't lobby for 1 year or 2 years or 6 months. It leaves the other half of the question, how do we know whether they're lobbying? How do we know whether this lobbying is happening? And we just don't know, because the Advisory Committee says that we're not a policing body. They don't police, they don't chase people up. So how can we find out? Now, so what we'd need to know is who are lobbying ministers, to see if any of the people who have been banned from lobbying are now lobbying. Now, we have some tools that the government has started publishing, is they publish lists of companies of outside interest that have met current ministers, so that might show the lobbying. But when they publish those lists, they never put the name of who comes from the company. So I spotted a couple of years ago that a very senior civil servant in the Department of Energy had met somebody from a company called URS. URS, an American company that had a very expensive, very sensitive contract working on nuclear materials for the Department of Energy. I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions of pounds of work here, and they were doing it badly. It wasn't going well. So if somebody from this American company is meeting a Department of Energy civil servant, that could be lobbying about a sensitive contract. But the question was, who was meeting? Who had come from URS? We didn't know. I did a Freedom of Information request, and the answer came back. It was a man called Lord Strathclyde, a former government minister who'd left government, joined URS. He'd been allowed to have the job. Cobra said, yeah, you can have the job. But they said, but you can't lobby for 2 years. And yet here he was, meeting a senior civil servant on behalf of the firm, which looks like lobbying. He said he wasn't lobbying. He said he was meeting, I don't know, for some other reason, a chat, I don't know. But he was meeting in the name of URS. That's what the record said. Potentially, if you have the names of the people who meet ministers, you could spot whether anyone is potentially breaking the rules on Akoba and whether those rules would need to be tightened up. The problem is they don't publish those names. Now, they did give that name in response to a Freedom of Information request 2 years ago, but ever since then, every time I've asked for the name of somebody meeting a minister off the list of we met these people from these companies, they refuse to say. They say it's confidential personal information.
And also, you can't make a Freedom of Information request about every single governmental meeting.
No.
They won't tell you.
See page 94, episode 12.
But also, it's not practical for journalists to do.
No, I mean, it's really obvious and simple, isn't it? Give us the list of the names.
We say that, look, if we could see people's applications, or at least what they say on their application about their prior involvement with a future employer, that would encourage them to tell the truth. Because if it's not true, it would be exposed.
Yeah.
They say, oh, no, if we give out any information at all, people won't play ball with the process. So
you can't
effectively
ask people to tell the truth because they'll lie.
Exactly.
Is anything being done about it at the moment? Because this seems to be a system that doesn't quite work in terms of the taxpayer.
Yeah, it doesn't work. There's a parliamentary committee called the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which is looking at a COBRA. It regularly looks at a COBRA, and it's forever saying, look, this is useless. Back in 2008, it said that former ministers in particular appear to be able to use with impunity the contracts they build up as public servants to further a private interest. Nothing's been done since.
A very senior figure said in 2010, he defined the revolving door not about greedy ex-ministers but about corporate influence, and he said, I'm talking about lobbying, and we all know how it works. The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisors for hire helping big business find the right way to get its way. And he said this is potentially crony capitalism. If we looked at this happening in a developing world country, ministers moving to firms that had big government contracts, there'd be no doubt people would say that is crony capitalism. It's a system which is potentially or actually corrupt. But we look at ourselves and we don't. But this very senior figure in 2010 said that, he had the courage to say that, and it was, of course, David Cameron, who went on to be Prime Minister and didn't do much to stop it. Now, of course, we're now in the position where David Cameron is an ex-minister, potentially for hire. So we will see whether he was describing a bad thing or writing out his own career trajectory. Now, I understand the first thing he suggested he might do is write his memoirs. Now, of course, in the olden days, Tory prime ministers, to be honest, they had a load of money anyway, so they weren't chasing it. And so they just did retire to write their memoirs. Harold Macmillan wrote 6 volumes of memoirs, which I don't think anyone has read. But, of course, he did, I think he more or less ran Macmillan the Publishers, so it's easy to do.
Right.
No one could say, no, Harold, no more volumes. So, possibly David Cameron, I'm sure he's read this report and he thought, oh, Ikes, I don't want to be seen as too much the heir to Blair. Maybe I'll sound more Macmillan and talk about my memoirs. But we shall see. We shall see.
Has there been much of a reaction from readers to the special report? Because that was in the last issue.
Yeah, we've had quite a few responses from readers, ranging from, well done for exposing this scandal, to, I suggest you file this report under no shit Sherlock. And that kind of captures it, really, because the scandal is that it's everywhere and that nothing's done about it, that this isn't especially new. I mean, it's getting worse. Even the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments says it's getting worse. But it's just been going on for so long and it's become such an accepted part of public life. That's the scandal, that it's so accepted among our top public officials that nothing gets done about it, and it gives undue influence to vested interests as a kind of permanent distortion in our democratic system.
Richard Brooks, ending this edition of Page 94. Thanks again to Richard and to Solomon. If you'd like to read a little more, we've got a follow-up piece all about Revolving Doors in issue 1427 of Private Eye, which is on newsstands now, and features, among other things, Jilly Cooper, Roger Daltrey and Liam Fox. 3 pretty cool cats, I think we can agree. Page 94 will return sometime before Labour's next leadership election. Until then, my name is Andrew Hunter-Murray. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.